All right, ladies and gentlemen, as we're all aware, the second half of 2.1 is approaching very, very, very quickly. And with the second half of 2.1, obviously, there's going to be some banners. Alongside Brant, we're going to have the rerun of Changli. And of course, with the rerun of Changli, we're going to have the rerun of her weapon. And let me say that Blazing Brilliance is genuinely one of the best weapons in the game, and there are a couple of reasons for that. If you've been keeping up with some of my content, you would have seen that I had a tier list of the most valuable 5-star weapons, and when it came to Changli's signature, Blazing Brilliance, I rated it as an S. The second highest ranking, probably one of the best weapons in the game overall, and it's kind of only overshadowed by a weapon that's just completely broken, String Master. And the reasons for Blazing Brilliance being so high and so valuable are kind of simple. It has a very unique blend of stats and effects that make it usable on not just Changli, but almost virtually every single sword user in the game. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because the use cases of a 5-star weapon, right? Especially with how Wuthering Waves' endgame works, the fact that you can slot it on different characters if you are using Changli in the TOA, or even if you're not in content like Whimpering Wastes. And having a 5-star weapon that you're able to slot on multiple users of the roster and get a lot of value from is one of the best monetary and or resource-based decisions you can make in the game. And so with that, let's dive a little bit into how this thing works. The main reason why Blazing Brilliance is so damn good is pretty simple. It's the base stats. And when it comes to the base stats, Blazing Brilliance has a pretty typical base attack of 587, and the reason why it's so good, a critical damage of 48.6. And so you might be wondering, why are base stats so important? Why is this something that we need to keep in mind as we're pulling this weapon? And why is it something that makes it better than the other options? And so let me show you all a bit of a reason for why this is the case. Or what you'll find for the standard 5-star weapon is that, well, this one gives the same exact base attack of 587, but a crit rate of 24.3. And the problem with crit rate on a sword weapon like this is that it turns out there are a lot of characters and even sequence nodes that don't really work out well with critical rate. And when it comes to Blazing Brilliance and the fact that it gives critical damage, there are a lot of potential recipients on the roster for this stat. And we're going to dive into some of them right now. Of course, you have Changli. And when you have the combination of Changli as well as her S2, which increases her crit rate by 25%, having a weapon that is critical damage is essentially key for maximizing your output on her. If you have Changli's S2, it's kind of mandatory that you have her weapon. Otherwise, when it comes to your stat portfolio, right, you're seeing over here my Changli as Emerald of Genesis with the built-in crit rate, and she also has a critical damage forecast. The problem with not having Changli's signature, if you do have her S2, is that we're maximizing crit damage everywhere we can across her build. And if we did factor in her S2, we would have 101% crit rate. And let me be honest, 101% crit rate is a little bit too much for the character. It's a little bit too much for any character. You'd rather have way more critical damage and maybe a crit rate around 70 to 80% instead. And so by having this weapon over here at a 48.6, you're able to maximize Changli, especially as you invest more in her. But that makes sense, right? That's something that was pretty typical. That's something that you probably expected. If you're going to invest heavily in a character sequence nodes, well, you better make sure that you have their signature as well. But this is the thing, ladies and gentlemen. Changli is not the only character that benefits super heavily from this weapon. And we're going to dive into some of them today. Spectral Rover is another incredible user of this weapon. And here's why. So when it comes to Spectral Rover, their best overall set is pretty much always going to be the new Eternal Radiance set. This is going to be their best one. And the reason for that is that Eternal Radiance, ladies and gentlemen, it gives a whopping 20% critical rate when you hit an enemy with Spectral Frazzle. And of course, you're always applying Spectral Frazzle whenever you're playing Spectral Rover. And that means that at a baseline, that 20% is going to be there. And when you combine it with something like a crit damage forecast, as well as Emerald of Genesis, you're going to run into a situation where you have 81.7% critical rate with that Spectral Frazzle buff. even with echoes, like this one, that are missing critical rate. I only have 4 out of 5 on here, and I'm already close to 80. However, there's more. Spectral Rover has a sequence node that further increases their critical rate by another 15% whenever they just cast and hit with their resonance skill. That means 61.7, missing a crit rate sub, plus 20 is 81.7, plus 15 more is going to be about 96.7% critical rate. And let's be real here, 97.6 is also a little bit too much for a character. And so what that means, to reach the full potential of a completely free-to-play character like just Spectral Rover, you will need this critical damage buff as well. Otherwise, your critical rate is kind of just too high when you could be adding, right, 48.6 to this number over here. Your Spectral Rover would be at 300 plus critical damage, and with all of the buffs factored in from the Eternal Radiance set and their S1, easily between 70 and 80% crit rate. That's a lot better of a breakdown compared to what we're seeing over here at 97. However, Spectral Rover isn't the only rover that's going to benefit from this heavily. You also have, well, of course, the Havoc version. And the full value of the Havoc version of Rover hasn't really been realized in a while, because 2.1 was when we finally got their S6. And let's be honest here, guys, this S6 is basically the same exact thing as Changli's S2. It's a bit harder to activate. You've actually got to build up your whole Forte circuit and then enter their Dark Surge mode by holding heavy attack with a full Forte circuit before activating it. But this gives the same exact 25% critical rate. And you know what that means? If you have all that critical rate built in, you're gonna be typically a bit too high. And so you're going to want Blazing Brilliance as Havoc Rover's signature as well. And so what this means is that this weapon at a baseline is essentially, based off the current state of the game and just its base stats, it's going to be mandatory if you want to reach the full potential of both Changli at S2 and then both versions of Rover when they have their sequence nodes that buff crit. And everybody should have access to them by now if they've completed the story. And so as a result, this weapon has so many more use cases. It is, in my eyes, especially if you're a low spender or even a free-to-play, it is one of the most valuable weapons in the game because it essentially unlocks a whole new level of power for some of the most powerful characters in the game, your Rovers. But that's not all. It also comes equipped with one of the most general weapon skills in the game. So what Crimson Phoenix, Blazing Brilliance's or Changli's signature weapon skill does is it first increases your attack by a flat 12%, so it pretty much gives the full bonus of Emerald of Genesis, and you then gain 1 stack of a Searing Feather buff upon dealing damage with a cooldown of half a second. You gain 5 stacks of the same exact buff every time you cast your Resonance skill. And let's talk a little bit about that. Characters like Spectral Rover and Havoc Rover are going to cast the Resonance skills multiple times. Havoc Rover, for example, they get a refresh on the Resonance skill after entering the Dark Surge state overall. They get Wingblade replaced by Life Taker, and the cooldown is entirely reset. That means that Havoc Rover is able to activate this effect twice in quick succession and max out this buff very easily. Spectral Rover, on the other hand, has some different advantages when it comes to this weapon. Their Resonance skill at a baseline is way short of a cooldown. It's about 6 seconds. And that means that it is incredibly easy to maintain uptime on this buff too and maximize its stacks. And ladies and gentlemen, each of these stacks with the 14 stack cap will give you 4% extra Resonance skill damage. That means at max stacks, that's 56%. 56% is one of the biggest buffs in the game. It is, in a lot of ways, bigger than the damage buff that you're seeing on other signatures. Remember, at max stacks is 56%, and then you have weapons like Jinxi's that only give about 48 at their maximum stacks. And so guess what? You know what that means. This is maximizing a lot of their damage potential too on those characters that we talked about before, the S2 Changli's, even the S0 Changli's, the Spectral Rovers, and the Havoc Rovers. And they're all able to stack up this effect as well. And of course, you do have the caveat that once you reach the maximum stacks, all of the stacks will be removed within 12 seconds. And honestly, when you compare it to other weapons released alongside Blazing Brilliance, this duration over here on Age of Harvest, Jinxi's signature, is 12 seconds as well. And so it's not like this weapon is weaker in terms of the buff duration. You just have to stack it up differently, and the overall reward of a maxed out buff is higher than other signatures. So it is very comparable in terms of strength, and some could say, honestly, even stronger. And so we've gone over, right, how both Rovers are able to fully utilize this weapon. We talked about how they're able to stack it up too, and they're also able to gain the full benefits. And thankfully, both of these Rovers, Spectro and Havoc, also deal a significant amount of resonance skill damage as well in their rotations. While it might have been better for them to have a more general weapon buff that buffs everything, they already have that through the attack bonus over here. And what this means is that every single part of this weapon works, from its base stats allowing these characters to reach their maximum potential, to the weapon's skill actually having a meaningful effect on their damage output. And what this means, guys, is that this weapon is really good if you like Changli. I dare say even better on Rover than it is on Changli if you like Rover as well. However, Rover isn't the only character that's able to receive some benefit. You have Sanhua, who, if built for damage, is actually far better on Blazing Brilliance than she is on Emerald of Genesis. And that's because Sanhua doesn't really need EOG's stats. Sanhua has a resonance cost of 100 on her liberation, and 100 means that she's able to, with maybe like 110 or 120 ER, have constant full uptime on her liberation. And there's pretty much no problem at all with that. There's no issues. The next character that receives a lot of benefit from Blazing Brilliance is also Yang Yang, for similar reasons. She also has a very low cost on her Resonance Liberation, and there's not really the need for ER from Emerald of Genesis. And she does do Resonance skill damage too. And so what that means is that this is just another character that's benefiting. And of course, for the individuals, right, who are looking to solo a lot of content in the game, or really like living on the edge, Dan Jin is another user, right? Because she's constantly casting her resonance skill across her rotations. She's actually stacking up Blazing Brilliance the fastest because her cooldown on her resonance skill is effectively 0. And so she basically has full uptime on the buff whenever she's using the weapon. And those are the 4-star users. We've already identified so many people on the roster that are able to benefit heavily from this weapon. And I dare say it's pretty much every sword user in the game. It is pretty much every sword user in the game. And I think the only sword user, when we think about it in the future, that's not going to benefit from this buff that much, it's going to be Brant, who's going to focus a lot more on ER, which this weapon doesn't have. And then it's also going to be Camellia, who of course focuses a lot more on basic attacks than resonance skills. And so the only two users who really aren't going to make use out of this weapon are going to be two limited ones, who you might not even have. But I think it's fair to say you're going to have a Dan Jin by now. You hopefully have a Dan Jin by now. You're also going to have a Yang Yang by now for sure, because she's free. And you're also going to have Sanhua too. And then you're going to have two versions of Rover as well. And so what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that Blazing Brilliance, this weapon, is probably the most versatile signature in the game in terms of actual users. That title, I believe, can be shared with Stringmaster, but Stringmaster doesn't have as many DPS damage dealing rectifier users compared to the swords. Stringmaster does have a lot of users, especially with the addition of Phoebe, but a lot of the users are 5-star characters too. You got Encore, you got Jeja, you got Yinlin, you got Phoebe. And then when it comes to this weapon, you've got a lot of 5-star users, and you've also got a shit ton of 4-star users and free-to-play units. And so when it comes to Blazing Brilliance, knowing that this weapon is going to be on banner in the next couple of days, I would highly recommend you give a look. I would highly recommend, if you are a fan of Rover or if you are a fan of the 4-star sword units, then give this a look. Because my oh my, it is going to let you reach thresholds of both damage and personal performance on those characters that is kind of just not possible with Emerald of Genesis. And the value of this weapon is going to decrease when there's another crit damage sword, but who knows when that's going to be, because Kurot is about to release a sword user via Brant, and this weapon, of course, does not have crit damage. It does not have crit. It has a little bit of crit rate, but it's way more focused on ER. And so who knows when Kurot's going to release another sword character again, and we're going to get a stat portfolio like this that we can play around with. And so with that, I think we've talked a lot about the value of this weapon. I think that it is a sleeper if you aren't aware of its power yet. It's definitely a great idea for a pickup if you're trying to reach that next level for your account. Let me know what you all think. Peace.